start with Rand Paul and the Tea Party. Joining me on the Chicago Tribune's Clarence Page and the Politico's Jonathan Martin. Gentlemen, let's take a look at GMA this morning. There he is. He's all over the place, Dr. Paul, Rand Paul. Let's listen to what he said today. He got into a bit more trouble, I think.
When does my honeymoon period start? I had a big victory. I thought I got a honeymoon period from you guys in the media. What I say is that I am against repealing the Civil Rights Act. I'm against repealing the Fair Housing Act. I've never campaigned on that. It's not part of our platform. And so what these are red herrings that people are trying to bring up because the Democrats are way behind in Kentucky and are going to have a tough time beating us down here. Where did your talking points come from? The Democrat National Committee. They also come from Rachel Maddow and MSNBC. You know, I've just been trashed up and down, and they have been saying things that are untrue. And when they say I'm for repealing the Civil Rights Act, it's absolutely false.
You know, I have to wonder about strategy. I want to start with you, Jonathan. I think you know the history of this, the provenance of this thing. It started on this program a couple nights ago where his opponent, his Democratic opponent who just won the nomination the same day he did, came out and said he had called for repeal of the Civil Rights Act. Not true. He had raised real questions about it. All the intimations he was giving certainly led us to believe he wouldn't have supported it at the time had he been in there. And then he's now blaming on Rachel for asking some very good questions. I was not proud of her. I was envious of the great work she did the other night and pinning him down and getting him to really refuse to answer. Why is he blaming MS? Why is he blaming Rachel? Why is he blaming his opponent for making this, what in his case was a false charge that he was for repeal?
Well, he's in a tough spot politically. He's a politician. This is what they do when they're trying to sort of get their way out of a jam. Try and sort of change the issue, reframe the issue. Paul's problem, though, is that he isn't necessarily saying that he wants to overturn the Civil Rights Act. The problem he has, as Rich Lowry, a conservative, wrote today in his column, Paul is finding out that he is not taking part in an Ayn Rand lecture series. He's running for the U.S. Senate. There's a difference between a sort of a lecture, sort of seminar type environment and real politics. It's hardball.
I agree with that.
Chris, as you
I agree
would
with
say.
that completely. And by the way, I think we'll get into it later, but Senator Kyle out in Arizona raised it very well, I think, Clarence, the other day when he said, this is the kind of thing you talk about at 2 o'clock in the dorms. By the way, you talk about it back in the early 60s. You don't talk about it now. Let me ask you, why do you think he turned his heat on Rachel and us, I guess, generally speaking, rather than turn it on his opponent, who's very slick, I think, and very smart as an opponent, maybe too tough? Why doesn't he just blame Conway?
Well, it's a political reflex, and especially for the Tea Party movement, to when all else fails, blame the media, right? And this works. But, you know, I was watching him, and I was reminded of really a male Sarah Palin, if you will. Someone who built up Tea Party hopes initially, comes with a good-looking resume,
on paper,
but then when they've got to face the media and get out there in the arena, you see they aren't ready for prime time. He's making all the wrong moves this week.
I think he's a lot heavier in terms of ideology than some of the other Tea Party people. I think he has real beliefs. They just don't pass muster in an environment which we are very concerned about civil rights, not as a debating point, but as a horror of recent past, the denial of them. Here's Rachel Maddow, by the way, on Wednesday. Let's listen. I think she did an incredible job of exposing this fellow's ideology. Here she is.
And should Woolworth lunch counters should have been allowed to stay segregated? Sorry, just yes or no?
What I think would happen... What I'm saying is that I don't believe in any discrimination. I don't believe that any private property should discriminate either. And I wouldn't attend, wouldn't support, wouldn't go to. But what you have to answer when you answer this point of view, which is an abstract, obscure conversation from 1964 that you want to bring up, but if you want to answer it, you have to say then that you decide the rules for all restaurants, and then do you decide that you want to allow them to carry weapons into restaurants?
You know, Jonathan, Rachel's doing what I love to do. She does it better than I do. I have to tell you, in that instant, that was brilliant. She kept asking him a good question. What about the bad recent past, when restaurants and lunch counters said no blacks allowed, when bathrooms along the highways wouldn't let blacks use the restroom? What about real cases? Fundamentalism, when it comes up against facts, doesn't do so well sometimes. Your thoughts?
Well, Chris, I think you touched on it in your phrase, real cases. And that's the problem that Paul has here, is that it's one thing. Look, nobody's saying he's a racist necessarily because he has problems philosophically with the Civil Rights Act.
Nobody's saying it, first of all.
The problem, Chris, is an application.
By the way, not necessarily. No one's saying it that I've heard.
Let me just finish, though, real fast. It's not just the Civil Rights Act. It's the fact that the Civil Rights Act, the minimum wage, overtime, regulations of, say, coal mines, regulation of the workplace in general, is pretty much settled in this country. It's pretty much accepted across the political spectrum. He has political views that would question those things, and that is inherently his challenge here. He's got views that are pure libertarian that are going to be tough for him to reconcile during the course of a general election campaign.
Well, let's talk about this is a great one. Here's George Stephanopoulos, another great interview, asking him about where he stands on the whole idea of having minimum wage laws. He chooses not to talk about what they should be, whether it's $7 an hour, $8 an hour, $10, but whether they should be. He gets to that, which is the heart of the ideology here. Let's listen.
Should the federal government be able to set a minimum wage?
Well, it's not a question of whether they can or cannot. I think that's decided. I think the question you have to ask is whether or not when you set the minimum wage it may cause unemployment. And I'm not sure the government's always really the smartest in the world as far as economic decisions.
But you wouldn't repeal it?
Repeal the minimum wage. And I think the vote comes up a lot of times on whether to raise it or not. And I think that what you have to ask yourself is, do you create unemployment by raising the minimum wage too high?
He's a Paul. He's a Paul.
The people, yeah, he's a Paul. He's trying to become a Paul. He's trying to learn now what you have to do in politics, which is
not comfortable.
Don't answer the philosophic question.
It's painful to watch, you know.
But you know why? Because we've got so many compromised politicians who every day of their lives make compromises. And here's a guy who's a philosopher who's stuck. He's on the horns of his own dilemma. He has strong absolutist beliefs against federal power.
That's what I mean about not being ready for prime time. You know, this is where the rubber meets the road for the Tea Party movement. They have been born and grown on two words: big government. Right. They've turned big government into this really nasty, ugly term. And now Rand Paul is reminding people of some of the things big government does that people like.
Okay, as we end this segment, I think it's vital that you both make the point I think you're making now. Let's clear it up here. The difference between a person holding a placard against federal power, Jonathan, and the wonders of the 10th Amendment, which is all powers reside in the states, not given to the federal government, which is a great idea. It's the principle of subsidiarity, which a lot of us were taught was a good thing. If you can do it locally, do it locally. If the individual should do it, let the individual do it. That principle is very American.
Jeffersonian.
But the practicality of giving the federal government responsibility in areas where the localities blew it, like in Jim Crow South, is the past and accepted, and this guy's weeding his way back into it. Jonathan.
Well, sure, and it's not just Jim Crow. It's housing issues. It's questions of the workplace, of labor laws. So, I mean, obviously, it's settled that there is a place for the federal government in those things. What's fascinating to me, Chris, and you touched on this, Rand Paul is plainly torn between his sort of dad's purist libertarian views, which I think he probably shares, and also the sort of pragmatic urge to win statewide here, to win a U.S. Senate seat. And those are two conflicting things, and they're right now very much in tension, and we're seeing it play out in real time. It's just fascinating.
Clarence?
Very true, and I think this is where, as I mentioned, rubber meets the road with the Tea Party movement, and that's going to make the difference in November. Is Rand Paul going to be another Barry Goldwater, who could only get, what was it, 6 states? But because he was a purist in his ideas, and those are ideas that Rand Paul is really regurgitating, and I remember those days. And we had
I remember you and I are the same age. You know what, John, I have to ask you the final question. What do the voters detest more, a man of principle who has to compromise them, like Rand Paul, or someone like Arlen Specter, who is basically available for compromise from day one?
Well, here's the good news for Rand Paul is that this year, and especially in the conservative state of Kentucky, I think a principled candidate may do better. Let's not forget, we talk a lot about Rand Paul and his problems right now. This is still a pretty conservative state. His Democratic opponent's got a lot of vulnerabilities, too. It's a long ways off until November. Let's not count out Rand Paul by any means.
Who's winning out there right now in the polling?
Paul certainly is winning right now, absolutely.
That's your view?
I predict Rand Paul's going to win, but I think it's going to have a negative impact on the rest of the country, though, as far as the other Tea Party movements around the country.
Yeah, I just hope he watches the media and the way they're covering this, because I think a lot of us are trying to do it straight and recognizing where he comes from and recognize the predicament he's in. It's not gotcha. And by the way, I don't think Rachel was engaging in gotcha journalism. I think she was first rate, and I'm so glad to be associated with her. Thank you, and congratulations again. I think that interview is going to be quoted again and again throughout the year. Rachel, congratulations. By the way, you guys, great conversation here. I think we're on the target here. Clarence, thank you so much. And Jonathan, so much.